Well, thank you very much. I will focus, excuse me for that, on Greece. I've heard that there is big improvement and unit labor costs falling and all that. A few days ago, the biggest Greek export firm, Viohalco, decided to move its seat from Greece to Belgium. We're talking about a company that has 15% of Greek exports. And at the same time, when asked, said that the financing cost for a Greek firm is impossible. It's more than 4% above what Germans pay in terms of interest rates. So the question is, and also our exports, Greek exports, apart from oil, have fallen, in fact, in the first 6 months of this year, also because of lack of financing in the private sector. Now, last year, 2012, we had general government expenditure 50% of GDP, financed partly because of ESMs and other people's money. And at the same time, the Greek private sector is obliterated through the difference in interest rates and all the rest. But the difference in interest rates is extremely serious because you cannot run a business with 10% interest rate in euros. So how can we change that in the foreseeable future? 1.4 million people unemployed, which means 28% of the working force. How can they find jobs in a private sector with 10% interest rates? That's my question.
I tried to be very careful in my introductory statement by differentiating between progress in the early indicators that are monitored closely by financial markets, and what the population feels. And unfortunately, there's a time lag. This time lag is normal, unfortunately. Early indicators like competitiveness, current account have to improve first. There have to be structural reforms before the benefits of that show up. This is unfortunate, but this is the experience of economic history around the world of the last few hundred years. There is a time lag, and it's painful. And in Greece, it's particularly painful because the starting position of Greece was much more difficult than the starting position of the other countries that have borrowed from the EFSF and the ESM, by far the worst. And therefore the adjustment is more difficult, takes more time, and is more painful. The indicators, the early indicators, are indeed improving significantly. Competitiveness has improved. Prices begin to fall, not sufficiently. They follow also with a time lag because the flexibility in the economy is not as good as, for instance, in Ireland. Therefore, this translation from improvement in unit labor cost into lower prices is much slower, but it is starting. Fiscal adjustment has been dramatically strong. In cyclically adjusted terms, in 3 years, 12% of GDP fiscal adjustment. That causes all the pain, of course, cutbacks in public services and higher taxes. But the progress in fiscal consolidation is there. And it has to be tough because the fiscal deficit in 2008-2009 was 15% of GDP. It had to be cut back. The financing conditions in the country are tough because there's not enough confidence yet for private financing. I hope it helps that, as very much part of the program, the Greek government is repaying domestic arrears, which should help many companies to regain liquidity that is needed as working capital and reduces the need to take loans. So it is moving in the right direction, but Greece is the most difficult case. I think in the second quarter we indeed had some stabilization. That is good, but it doesn't mean that the people feel any better. But I think it's also fair to say that without the financing from the EFSF and also the IMF, of course, the adjustment would have been even tougher, because the financing from EFSF and IMF means that the adjustments, the necessary adjustment, cannot be avoided, but it can be spread out over a number of years. Otherwise, it would have to happen immediately, and that would have been actually worse.
But my real question is, why is this, there is an imbalance in adjustment between the state sector and the private sector in Greece? Because at the moment, all the unemployed, 99% of the unemployed, come from the private sector. Why is this imbalance? We hope the private sector will get us out, and it gets most of the stick. That's the real question.
I think many of the reforms that are part of the adjustment program, supervised by the Troika, will lead to a situation that there is more room for the private sector to develop. The public sector is shrinking in Greece, obviously, and the private sector, through deregulation, will be able to create jobs and to grow. And with all the problems that you described quite correctly, I find it encouraging that the OECD, in its annual survey of reforms in all its member states, and you know the OECD goes from Korea to Mexico and all the industrialized countries, they put Greece at the top of the list, that there are more reforms happening in Greece than in any other OECD country. This is encouraging because it tells me that there will be progress. But we also know that initially structural reforms and fiscal adjustment are a burden for the population. And because the situation was so difficult, it was really bad 4 years ago, this adjustment path is long and very severe. But with the reforms, and the OECD indicates that it's really happening. I'm sorry Mr. Klintz has left because we had a long debate already about that in Vilnius. He always doubts that there are really reforms happening. I think they are happening, and that is encouraging, and I hope the Greek population has the patience to wait for the good results.